All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring diet and chronic diseases. Stuff like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. I've got a really interesting mix of sources here. Personal stories, some expert opinions, research data. Seems like you're really trying to get to the bottom of what's actually healthy in a world where, let's be honest, there's a lot of conflicting information out there.
Yeah, and that's a very real problem, isn't it? There's so much information, and everyone's got an opinion.
Exactly. And one of the stats that really jumped out at me from all this material, get this, 1 in 3 Medicare dollars and 1 in 10 healthcare dollars in general are spent on diabetes care. I mean, that's huge. Doesn't that make you wonder, like, are we even doing enough to prevent it in the first place?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It definitely suggests that, maybe we need to be looking at things a little differently. Maybe our approach to diet and lifestyle needs a bit of a shakeup.
Speaking of shaking things up, one of the sources you sent over is about a filmmaker named Kip. And he really starts questioning everything he thought he knew about healthy eating after the World Health Organization. The WHO, they come out and say processed meat is a group 1 carcinogen.
Wow, that's in the same category as cigarettes, asbestos, right?
Yeah,
Pretty serious stuff.
exactly. And think about it, processed meat, that's hot dogs, bacon, sausage, all those things a lot of us grew up eating without even thinking twice. And then this guy, Kip, he tries to get some answers from the American Cancer Society, like, why are they still promoting processed meat on their website when the WHO is saying it's a carcinogen? And they basically just dodge his questions. It's really frustrating for him, and it kind of makes you wonder who these big organizations are actually serving right
Yeah, it does make you think. You'd hope they'd be a little more transparent.
now. Right. So another source you sent is about Dr. Neil Barnard. He's a big name in diabetes research, and he makes this really interesting argument. He says diabetes isn't caused by sugar, like a lot of people think, but by a diet high in fat, especially the kind of fat we get from animal products.
He's not the only one saying that. You also included Dr. Garth Davis, the bariatric surgeon, and he agrees. He points to this study that found, get this, more carbs were actually linked to less diabetes.
It really makes you rethink everything you've heard about carbs. The experts you sent over, they explain it pretty clearly. Carbs, they're stored as glycogen or they get burned up for energy. It's the fat, especially saturated fat from meat and dairy, that seems to be the real culprit here.
And then there's that Harvard study you included too, the one that found that just one serving of processed meat a day, like a single hot dog, could increase the risk of developing diabetes by over 50%.
It really makes you stop and think before you grab that next hot dog, doesn't it?
Right.
And then you see the American Diabetes Association, and they've got recipes for things like bacon-wrapped shrimp on their website. Seems a bit hypocritical, don't you think?
Yeah, you'd think they'd be a little more careful about what they're promoting.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second. Let's talk heart disease. It's the leading cause of death globally. Just think, every hour, the number of people who die from heart disease is like 4 jumbo jets crashing.
Wow, that puts it in perspective. That's scary.
You included this really powerful story from Amy Resnick. She was told she was at high risk of having a heart attack within 30 days even because of her high C-reactive protein levels. It just shows you how heart disease can sneak up on you.
It really does. And then there's Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, the heart surgeon. He says that eating an animal-based diet is a huge contributor to this epidemic, and the damage isn't just happening slowly over decades. He says even eating one meat-based meal can cause inflammation and stiffening of the arteries.
Yeah, that kind of goes against the idea that heart disease develops slowly, right? Makes you think twice.
And the American Heart Association, you found out they have beef recipes on their website, right?
It's really ironic, isn't it? They're promoting the very thing that their own experts say is harmful.
Yeah, a little confusing, to say the least.
Okay, so that kind of brings us to the whole cholesterol debate. There's so much back and forth about whether saturated fat and cholesterol are actually bad for us or not. What did you find out about that from the sources you looked at?
Well, one thing that was really interesting was this evidence you found that the dairy industry has been actively trying to change the public's perception of saturated fat. Remember that 2008 meeting where the global dairy industry basically said they needed to neutralize the negative impact of milk fat? That was pretty revealing.
Yeah, that's pretty direct, and they're using some pretty clever tactics too.
Like that one where they compare eggs to McDonald's sausage McMuffins. They're trying to make eggs seem healthier by comparison, even though those McMuffins are obviously really processed.
Yeah, makes you wonder what their motives are. But anyway, let's talk specifically about eggs and dairy. You sent over a study that suggests eating just one egg a day could be as bad for your life expectancy as smoking 5 cigarettes a day.
I know, right? It's like, whoa, hold the eggs. The study was saying that the yolk is basically concentrated fat and cholesterol that's meant to help a baby chick grow, and it's not really what we could be putting into our bodies.
And then there's all this research linking dairy to autoimmune diseases like eczema, acne, even asthma, and multiple sclerosis.
It's a long way from the milk does a body good message we grew up with. You even found that Harvard study that debunked the whole milk builds strong bones thing. It showed there was no difference in fracture rates between people who drank milk and those who didn't.
And get this, the countries with the highest dairy consumption also have the highest rates of osteoporosis. It's like, maybe dairy isn't doing what we thought it was.
It makes you think. You also send over some stuff about casein, the protein in dairy that breaks down into these things called casomorphins. They act on the brain kind of like heroin does, which maybe explains why cheese is so addictive.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that. And cow's milk has way more casein than human breast milk, like almost 10 times more.
It's pretty wild, and it makes you wonder what all that casein is doing to our bodies.
Especially when you consider the link between dairy and cancer, especially hormone-related cancers like breast cancer, prostate cancer, and ovarian cancer. One study even found that having just one serving of whole dairy a day could increase the risk of dying from breast cancer by almost 50% in women who already had the disease.
It's really concerning.
And then you have organizations like Susan G. Komen, who are supposed to be fighting breast cancer, and they're not really talking about this link to dairy at all. And on top of that, you've got the Pink Ribbon campaign partnering with yogurt companies to put their logos on dairy products. It's all a bit confusing.
Yeah, you'd think there would be a clearer message.
It definitely raises some questions about their priorities. But let's shift gears again to another topic. You found some concerning information about the whole issue of drugs in our food supply.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming. The Center for Food Safety says that they give animals raised for food at least 450 different drugs. And get this, 80% of all the antibiotics used in the U.S. are going to animal agriculture.
80%. That's crazy. What does all that drug use mean for us?
Well, one big worry is that those drugs can end up in the meat we eat. And then there are other contaminants too, like ractopamine. That's a drug they give to animals to make them grow faster, and different kinds of hormones. There are also concerns about antibiotic resistance.
You mentioned how hard it was to find clear information about the health and environmental impacts of all these drugs they're giving to animals.
Yeah, there's a real lack of transparency. Companies often say they can't release information because it's confidential business information.
It's like they're hiding something.
Right. We deserve to know what's in our food and how it might be affecting us.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about the environmental side of things for a minute. What did you find out about the impact of animal agriculture on the environment?
Honestly, it's pretty bleak. Animal agriculture is a huge contributor to climate change. It actually produces more greenhouse gases than all the cars, trucks, planes, and ships in the world combined. And it's a major driver of deforestation, water pollution, species extinction.
It's kind of overwhelming when you think about it. And then there's the whole issue of CAFOs, those concentrated animal feeding operations, where they cram all those animals together in these horrific conditions.
Right, they're living in their own waste, diseases are spreading like wildfire. It's really a breeding ground for all kinds of problems. And it's not just bad for the animals, it affects us too. Did you know that 3,000 people die every year in the U.S. just from foodborne illnesses? That's more than the number of people who died in the 9/11 attacks.
It's terrifying. You also mentioned Duplin County in North Carolina as an example of how bad things can get.
It's a really disturbing case. They have 10 million pigs in that one county alone, and they produce as much waste as a city of 100 million people.
That's insane. Where does all that waste even go?
A lot of it ends up in these open-air lagoons, and they leak, which contaminates groundwater and nearby rivers and streams. They also spray the waste onto fields as fertilizer, which pollutes the environment even more.
And you talked about how people living near these CAFOs are suffering from asthma, cancer, and other health problems that could be linked to the pollution.
It's a really sad situation, and it's not fair to those communities. It's a classic example of environmental injustice. They often put these CAFOs near low-income communities and communities of color. It's like they're being sacrificed so the rest of us can have cheap meat.
It makes you realize that what we eat isn't just a personal choice. It affects so many other things, the environment, other people's health, animal welfare.
Yeah, it's all connected.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? Your research also points to a potential solution, a plant-based diet.
Absolutely. A plant-based diet has the potential to be a win-win for everyone, for our health, for the planet, and for animals.
Okay, so let's talk about this plant-based solution. First of all, let's clear up some of the misconceptions. For example, do we really need meat for protein?
Not at all. All protein actually comes from plants originally. Animals eat plants to get their protein, so we can just cut out the middleman and get our protein straight from the source.
That makes sense. And plant protein doesn't come with all the added baggage of cholesterol, saturated fat, and those drug residues we were talking about.
Exactly. And think about it, the biggest and strongest animals on Earth, gorillas, elephants, rhinos, they're all herbivores.
That's a good point. What about the argument that humans need meat to thrive? You mentioned that story about Dr. Walter Kempner, who was reversing chronic diseases back in the 1940s with a plant-based diet of just white rice, fruit, and table sugar.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story. It shows that the body can heal itself when given the right conditions, even if the diet isn't perfect.
It makes you wonder if we've been overcomplicating things.
It really does. And there's more and more evidence coming out all the time showing that a plant-based diet can reverse heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses.
We talked about some of that research earlier, like Dr. Esselstyn's work with heart disease patients and Dr. Barnard's findings on diabetes.
It's really impressive stuff.
It's not just about preventing or reversing disease either. It's about feeling your best, having more energy, living a longer, healthier life.
You also included the story of Jane Chapman, who reversed her severe osteoarthritis after switching to a plant-based diet and incorporating some fasting. She was in so much pain, facing hip replacements and everything, but after just 2 weeks on a plant-based diet, she was able to walk without assistance and get off all her medications.
That's amazing.
Right.
It really highlights the power of food as medicine.
And what's really cool is that a plant-based diet can benefit multiple aspects of our health at the same time. It's not like you have to follow one diet for your heart and another for your diabetes.
That's like a one-stop shop for better health. Okay, so let's say someone is convinced and wants to give this plant-based thing a try. Where do they even begin? What does a plant-based diet actually look like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the good news is that there's no one right way to eat plant-based. It's about finding what works for you and your lifestyle. But let's break down some of the key principles and practical tips to get started.
Sounds good. So first things first, what foods are we talking about when we say plant-based? What's on the menu? And what's off limits?
It's pretty straightforward. We're talking about foods that come from plants. Fruits, vegetables, legumes, things like beans and lentils, whole grains like quinoa and brown rice, nuts, seeds.
So no more cheeseburgers and ice cream.
I know that might be a tough one for some people. But the good news is there are so many delicious plant-based alternatives now. Plant-based burgers, cheeses, even ice creams, you name it.
So you don't have to give up those familiar flavors and textures. You can still enjoy them, just in a healthier, more compassionate way.
Exactly. And the key is to focus on whole, unprocessed foods.
So like fresh fruits and veggies, beans, lentils.
Right. Those are the foundation of a healthy plant-based diet.
This isn't about deprivation.
Not at all. It's about enjoying an abundance of delicious, nourishing food.
Okay, so let's say someone wants to make the switch to a plant-based diet. Should they just dive in head first, or is there a better way to go about it?
I always recommend a gradual approach. You don't have to go cold turkey overnight.
Yeah, that can be overwhelming.
Exactly. Start by adding in one plant-based meal a day, and then slowly increase it to 2, and so on. Small, sustainable changes are key.
I like the idea of Meatless Monday.
Me too. It's a fun way to ease into it.
And there are tons of resources out there to help people find delicious plant-based recipes. Cookbooks, websites, blogs.
Oh yeah, there's no shortage of inspiration.
And meal prepping can be a lifesaver. You can batch cook grains, beans, roasted veggies ahead of time.
That's a great strategy.
And don't be afraid to try new things, experiment with different cuisines.
Absolutely. Plant-based cooking is all about creativity and exploring new flavors.
One of my favorite things about eating this way is focusing on fresh, seasonal ingredients. It's a great way to reconnect with nature.
Totally. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. There will be bumps in the road, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Don't beat yourself up if you have a slip-up or crave something non-vegan. Just get back on track and keep moving forward.
Progress over perfection, right?
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone. There's a huge community of people out there who are embracing a plant-based lifestyle. You can find support groups, online communities.
It's a good reminder that we're all in this together.
We are.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's address some common concerns that people often have about plant-based diets. One of the biggest ones is protein. We already talked about how protein actually comes from plants originally, but are there specific plant-based foods that are especially good sources of protein? How can people make sure they're getting enough?
It's a valid concern, but it's actually easier than you might think to get enough protein on a plant-based diet.
So break it down for us. What are some of the best sources of plant-based protein?
Legumes are a great place to start. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, they're all packed with protein.
And tofu tempeh.
Yes. Those are soy-based products that are really versatile and can be used in so many different ways.
And what about whole grains?
Quinoa, brown rice, oats, they all contribute to your protein intake.
And nuts and seeds, right?
Absolutely. Almonds, pumpkin seeds, those are great sources of protein and healthy fats.
So it sounds like there are plenty of options.
There really are. And if you're worried about getting enough, you can always track your intake for a few days just to get a sense of where you're at. But most people find that if they're eating a variety of plant-based foods, they're naturally getting all the protein they need.
Okay, that's good to know. What about iron? Is it true that plant-based diets can lead to iron deficiency?
It's a common concern, but it's definitely manageable.
So how can we make sure we're getting enough iron on a plant-based diet?
Well, there are two types of iron. Heme iron, which is found in animal products, and non-heme iron, which is found in plants. Heme iron is more easily absorbed by the body, but non-heme iron can be just as effective if you eat it strategically.
What do you mean by strategically?
Pairing non-heme iron sources with foods rich in vitamin C can really boost absorption.
Oh, that's interesting. So like squeezing lemon juice over your lentils or adding bell peppers to your tofu stir fry.
Exactly. Those are great examples.
Are there any plant-based foods that are especially good sources of iron?
Definitely. Lentils are a great one. Spinach, tofu, kidney beans, blackstrap molasses.
So as long as we're being mindful about combining those foods strategically, we can get all the iron we need from plants.
Exactly. And if you have any concerns, you can always get your iron levels checked with a blood test.
Okay, what about calcium? We already debunked the myth that dairy is essential for strong bones, but where do we get calcium if we're not eating dairy?
Believe it or not, there are tons of plant-based foods that are packed with calcium. Leafy green vegetables like kale, collard greens, bok choy.
Oh, I love adding spinach to my smoothies.
That's a great way to get some extra greens. And tofu, especially calcium-set tofu, is a fantastic source.
And what about plant milks?
Yes. Almond milk, soy milk, oat milk. They're often fortified with calcium, and sometimes they even have more than cow's milk.
And almonds, sesame seeds?
Those are good sources, too.
So once again, it sounds like variety is key.
It really is.
Okay, one last thing before we move on, the social aspect of plant-based eating. Let's face it, it can be a little awkward sometimes when you're the only one at the table not eating meat or dairy. Do you have any advice for navigating social situations like that?
It's a really common concern, and it can definitely be challenging. The most important thing is to remember that you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to compromise your values.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you know you're going to be in a situation where food will be served, like a dinner party or something, offer to bring a plant-based dish to share. That way, you'll have something delicious to eat, and you can even introduce others to plant-based food.
That's a great idea. It takes the pressure off.
Exactly. And if you're eating out at a restaurant, don't be shy about asking questions and making modifications.
Most restaurants are pretty accommodating these days.
They are. And if all else fails, you can usually order a few plant-based sides or appetizers to make your own meal.
And it's okay to politely decline food that doesn't align with your choices.
Absolutely. It's your body, and you have the right to choose what you put into it. And if someone questions your choices or makes comments, you don't have to defend your decision. Just politely state your preference and move on.
I like the phrase, "This is what works for me." It's simple and effective.
It is. And remember, there are millions of people around the world who are embracing a plant-based lifestyle. You're not alone. There are online communities and support groups where you can connect with other people who are going through the same thing.
That's a good point. It can be really helpful to connect with other people who understand what you're going through.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to stop for now.
Sounds good.
We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the inspiring stories of individuals who have experienced remarkable transformations on a plant-based journey. We'll also delve deeper into the practical aspects of making the switch, including tips, strategies, and resources. So stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive. So in that last part, we were getting into some pretty heavy stuff, with all those potential health risks linked to animal products. But then we started talking about the possibility of a plant-based diet as a solution. And that's what I want to dig into more now. I mean, is it really possible to reverse these chronic conditions like heart disease and diabetes just by changing what you eat? Can people actually thrive on a plant-based diet?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And the answer is a resounding yes.
Yeah.
We've already mentioned a few examples, but honestly, the evidence just keeps piling up. There are more and more studies showing that a plant-based diet can not only prevent these conditions, but actually reverse them.
You know, one of the things that really stuck with me from the sources you sent over was that story about Kip, the filmmaker. After he switched to a plant-based diet, he said he had so much more energy, and he even got a personal best time in a marathon.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's like his body was finally able to function the way it was meant to.
Right. And it makes sense, you know, if you're not constantly putting all those unhealthy things into your body, it frees up your energy to do other things like heal and repair.
And Kip's story is just one of many. I mean, there are countless people out there who are experiencing incredible health improvements after going plant-based.
And it's not just anecdotal either. There's solid scientific research to back it up, like the research by Dr. Esselstyn that we talked about earlier, where he found that almost all of his heart disease patients were able to avoid major cardiac events by going plant-based.
Yeah, 99.4% of them, to
Wow.
be exact. It's pretty remarkable. It challenges the whole idea that heart disease is just inevitable or that the only options are medication and surgery.
And it's not just heart disease either. Dr. Barnard has seen similar success with his patients reversing type 2 diabetes, lowering their blood pressure. Some of them even get off all their medications completely.
It's incredible. And the really interesting thing is that a plant-based diet doesn't just mask the symptoms. It actually seems to address the underlying causes of these diseases.
It's like giving your body the tools it needs to actually heal itself.
Exactly.
And it's not just about preventing or reversing disease either. It's about feeling your best, having more energy, being more mentally sharp, and just living a longer, healthier life.
You mentioned the story of Jane Chapman earlier, too. That one really blew me away. She was dealing with such severe osteoarthritis that she was facing hip replacements. But after just 2 weeks on a plant-based diet and incorporating some fasting, she was able to walk without assistance and get off all her medications.
It's a great example of the power of food as medicine. It really shows that even when things seem really bad, there's still hope for healing.
Yeah, it's inspiring. And what's really remarkable is that a plant-based diet can have such a positive impact on so many different aspects of our health. It's not just a targeted solution for one specific condition. It's like a holistic approach to overall well-being.
It's like a one-stop shop for better health.
I like that.
So, okay, let's say someone's listening to this and thinking, all right, I'm convinced. I want to give this plant-based thing a try. But then they're like, okay, but where do I even start? What does a plant-based diet actually look like?
I get that. It can seem a little daunting at first, but it's really not that complicated.
So break it down for us. What are the basics? What kind of foods are we talking about?
Well, like we said before, it's all about focusing on foods that come from plants. Fruits, vegetables, legumes, things like beans and lentils, whole grains like quinoa and brown rice, nuts, seeds, healthy fats like you find in avocados and olive oil.
Okay, so that sounds pretty good, but does that mean saying goodbye to all my favorite comfort foods, like no more cheeseburgers, no more ice cream?
I know, but the amazing thing is, there are so many incredible plant-based alternatives out there now. Plant-based burgers, cheeses, ice creams, you name it. You can still enjoy those familiar flavors and textures, just in a healthier and more compassionate way.
So you don't have to give up on taste or enjoyment.
Not at all. And one of the biggest keys is to focus on whole, unprocessed foods as much as possible.
So like fresh produce, beans, lentils, whole grains.
Exactly. Those are the foundation of a healthy plant-based diet.
This isn't about deprivation, right?
No, definitely not. It's about abundance and enjoying all the delicious and nourishing foods that nature has to offer.
I love that. Okay, so what about the transition? Let's say someone's ready to make the switch. Do they just dive in head first?
I wouldn't recommend that. It can be a little overwhelming to try to change everything overnight. A gradual approach is usually best.
So what, like start with one plant-based meal a day?
Exactly. And then you can slowly increase it from there, maybe to 2 plant-based meals a day, and so on. The key is to make small, sustainable changes that you can stick with.
I like the idea of meatless Mondays. It's a fun and easy way to start experimenting with plant-based cooking.
Totally. And there are tons of resources out there to help you find delicious recipes and get creative in the kitchen, cookbooks, websites, blogs, you name it.
Oh, yeah, and meal prepping could be a huge help too. You can cook big batches of grains, beans, roasted veggies ahead of time, and then mix and match them for quick and easy meals throughout the week.
That's such a good idea. And don't be afraid to try new things, experiment with different cuisines and flavors. Plant-based cooking is all about creativity and having fun in the kitchen.
One of the things I love most about eating this way is the emphasis on fresh, seasonal produce. It's such a great way to reconnect with nature and really appreciate where our food comes from.
I agree. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. You're not going to be perfect all the time, and that's okay.
There will be bumps in the road.
Exactly. Don't beat yourself up if you have a slip up or a craving for something non-vegan. Just get back on track and keep moving forward.
Progress over perfection, right?
Yeah, exactly. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are tons of online communities, support groups, and resources out there for people who are exploring a plant-based lifestyle.
It can be really helpful to connect with other people who are going through the same thing. It's a good reminder that you're part of a movement and you're not alone.
I love that. We're all in this together.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of the conversation, I want to touch on a few common concerns that people often have about plant-based diets. One of the biggest ones, of course, is protein. We already debunked the myth that you need meat to get protein, but a lot of people still wonder, okay, but how do I make sure I'm getting enough protein on a plant-based diet?
Yeah, it's a valid question, but honestly, getting enough protein on a plant-based diet is much easier than people think.
Okay, so what are some of the best sources of plant-based protein? Give us the rundown.
Well, legumes are definitely a top contender.
Yeah.
Beans, lentils, chickpeas, they're all great sources of protein and fiber.
And tofu, tempeh, those are good ones too, right?
Exactly. Soy-based products are super versatile and can be used in so many different ways.
And what about whole grains?
Yeah, quinoa, brown rice, oats, they all contribute to your protein intake as well. And then, of course, you've got nuts and seeds, which are great sources of protein and healthy fats.
Almonds, pumpkin seeds, I love adding those to my smoothies and oatmeal.
Perfect. So really, there are tons of options. And if you're ever concerned about whether you're getting enough, you can always track your protein intake for a few days using a food journal or an app just to get a sense of where you're at. But honestly, most people find that if they're eating a variety of plant-based foods, they're naturally getting all the protein they need.
All right, that makes sense. What about iron? Is it true that plant-based diets can lead to iron deficiency?
It's a common concern, but with a little bit of know-how, it's totally manageable.
Okay, so how do we make sure we're getting enough iron if we're not eating meat?
So the first thing to know is that there are actually two types of iron. Heme iron, which is found in animal products, and non-heme iron, which is found in plants. Heme iron is absorbed more easily by the body, but non-heme iron can be just as effective if you eat it the right way.
What do you mean the right way?
The trick is to pair your non-Hemesny iron sources with foods that are rich in vitamin C. Vitamin C helps your body absorb iron more efficiently. So, for example, you could squeeze some lemon juice over your lentils or add some bell peppers to your tofu stir-fry.
Oh, that's a good tip. Are there any specific plant-based foods that are particularly high in iron?
Absolutely. Lentils are a great source of iron, as are spinach, tofu, kidney beans, and blackstrap molasses.
So as long as we're being mindful about combining those iron-rich foods with vitamin C, we can get all the iron we need from plants.
Exactly. And like we talked about with protein, if you have any concerns, you can always get your iron levels checked with a simple blood test.
Okay, good to know. Now, what about calcium? I know we already talked about how we don't actually need dairy for strong bones, but a lot of people still wonder where they're supposed to get their calcium if they're not drinking milk.
Right, and it might surprise people to learn that there are actually tons of plant-based sources of calcium.
So what are some of the best ones?
Leafy green vegetables are a great place to start. Things like kale, collard greens, bok choy. They're all surprisingly high in calcium.
I love putting spinach in my smoothies.
Perfect. That's a great way to get an extra boost of calcium in greens without even noticing it. And then, of course, tofu, especially calcium-set tofu, is another excellent source.
Oh, and what about plant milks?
Yeah, a lot of plant milks like almond milk, soy milk, oat milk are fortified with calcium, and sometimes they even have more calcium than cow's milk.
Wow, that's good to know. And I know almonds and sesame seeds are good sources too, right?
They are, and dried figs as well.
Okay, so once again, it sounds like the key is variety.
Exactly. The more variety you can incorporate into your diet, the better.
And remember, we're talking about food, not supplements.
Exactly. It's always best to get your nutrients from whole foods whenever possible.
Okay, I want to touch on one more thing before we move on. We've been talking a lot about the health benefits of a plant-based diet, but there's also the social aspect to consider. It can be a little tricky navigating social situations when you're the only one at the table who's not eating meat or dairy. Do you have any advice for dealing with that?
Yeah, it's a common experience, and it can definitely be challenging. But there are some things you can do to make it easier on yourself.
Like what?
Well, first of all, be prepared. If you know you're going to be in a situation where food is going to be served, like a dinner party or a potluck or something, offer to bring a plant-based dish to share. That way you know you'll have something delicious to eat. And it's also a great way to introduce other people to plant-based food.
That's a great idea. It kind of takes the pressure off too, right?
It does. And if you're eating out at a restaurant, don't be shy about asking questions and requesting modifications.
Yeah, most restaurants are pretty accommodating these days.
They are. And if all else fails, you can usually order a few plant-based sides or appetizers and create your own meal.
And it's okay to politely decline food that doesn't align with your choices. You don't have to feel pressured to eat something you don't want to.
Absolutely. It's your body, and you have the right to choose what you put into it.
Well,
And if someone questions your choices or makes a comment, you don't have to get into a debate or feel like you have to defend your decision. You can just politely say something like, "This is what works for me."
yeah, I like that. It's simple and it sets a boundary. And it's also a good reminder that this is a personal choice and you don't owe anyone an explanation.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that you're not alone in this. There are literally millions of people around the world who are embracing a plant-based lifestyle. And there are so many online communities and support groups where you can connect with other people who understand what you're going through and share tips and encouragement.
It's a good reminder that we're all part of a bigger movement and we're all in this together.
We are.
Well, I think that's a good place to pause for now. But before we go, I just want to say that I'm really impressed with all the information you've shared and how well you've been able to break down these complex topics.
Oh, well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. It's been really insightful, and I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to explore the world of plant-based eating and all the amazing possibilities it holds. We'll be back soon for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll be talking about the ethical and environmental dimensions of our food choices and exploring what we can all do to create a more just and sustainable food system. So stay tuned. All right, welcome back to our deep dive. So we've talked about the potential health risks of animal products, and we've explored the idea of a plant-based diet as a solution. But there's another really important piece of this puzzle that we need to talk about, the ethical and environmental impact of our food choices.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about what we're putting into our own bodies.
Mhm.
It's about the ripple effects of those choices on the world around us.
Right. And Kip, the filmmaker we've been talking about throughout this deep dive, he's a great example of that, right? He started out just focusing on his personal health, but then as he learned more, it became about so much more than that. It became about the connection between our health, the environment, and the well-being of animals.
I think that's a pretty common experience for people who start exploring a plant-based lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
They begin with this desire to improve their own health, but then they start to question the impact of their choices on the planet, on other living beings.
And when you really look at the realities of industrial animal agriculture, it's hard to ignore those ethical questions. We were talking about CFOs earlier, those concentrated animal feeding operations where they keep all those animals crammed together in those horrible conditions.
It's a far cry from those happy cows and chickens you see in the commercials, right?
Yeah, those images are definitely designed to make us feel better about where our food comes from. But the truth is, the consequences of this system go way beyond the suffering of those animals. I mean, we talked about how animal agriculture is a major contributor to climate change, right? It produces more greenhouse gases than all the cars, trucks, planes, and ships in the world combined. And it's also a leading cause of deforestation, water pollution, species extinction.
It's pretty mind-boggling when you think about it. The food choices we make literally have the power to shape the planet.
And then there's the social justice aspect of it too, right? We talked about how they often put these CAFOs in low-income communities and communities of color.
Right, and those communities end up bearing the brunt of the pollution and the health problems that come with it. It's a real issue of environmental injustice.
It's a lot to take in. I mean, it feels like our food choices are connected to so many different issues. Personal health, environmental sustainability, social justice, animal welfare. It can feel kind of overwhelming, to be
It
honest.
is a lot. It's this really complex web of interconnected challenges. But it's important to remember that we're not powerless. Becoming aware of these connective is actually the first step toward making more conscious choices.
So, what can we do? It feels like we're up against these really powerful forces.
Well, it's true that these industries have a lot of power and influence. But I think it's important to remember that we have power too. We have the power to choose what we buy, what we eat, what we support.
So, it's like voting with our dollars.
Exactly. Every time we choose a plant-based meal, we're sending a message to the marketplace that we want a different kind of food system. We want a system that's healthier for us, for the planet, and for animals.
And we can also support organizations that are working to change the system, right? There are lots of groups out there fighting for animal welfare, environmental protection, food justice.
Yeah, absolutely. We can donate to these organizations, volunteer our time, spread the word about their work.
And we can advocate for policy changes too, right?
Absolutely. We can contact our elected officials
Hmm.
and let them know that we care about these issues. We can urge them to support policies that promote plant-based agriculture and subsidies for factory farms, protect animal welfare.
Yeah, there are so many things we can do, even if they seem small.
I think that's a really important point. Even small actions, when multiplied by millions of people, can create massive change.
It gives me hope.
Me too.
Well, this deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. We've explored so much from the potential health risks of animal products to the exciting possibilities of a plant-based lifestyle and the ethical and environmental implications of our food choices.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and I really hope this conversation has encouraged our listeners to take a closer look at their own dietary choices and consider the impact those choices are having.
We've seen how powerful those choices can be, both for our own health and for the health of the planet.
I think Kip summed it up really well when he said that switching to a plant-based diet was about more than just food for him. It was about aligning his actions with his values and becoming part of something bigger than himself.
That's what it's all about. Creating a more compassionate and sustainable world, one delicious bite at a time.
I love that. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it informative and inspiring.
We encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making choices that align with your values.
And remember, you have the power to change the world, one bite at a time.